after the invasion, he ordered them to drive on the other side of the road, hence, the left-hand drive vehicles from there on in. When we bought her, she was in fact up and running, albeit with a slightly noisy engine. I'm quite sensitive to the fact that she was in the same family in Prague from day one. And although we have, done a fair degree of the refurbishment, one aspect I'm very keen to preserve is the originality of the trim, because although it may be a wee bit farmyardish, it sort of exudes character, 1938 type smells, or maybe that's my overactive imagination. But I don't want to make her too pretty for the sake of, spoiling the originality. She's a character. It does help now that she's got brakes. The engine has been completely rebuilt. We have a minor rattle off the timing chain, which we're going to live with. I think one has to keep it in context. She will march along happily all day and all night at about 45 miles an hour, although they're reputed to have been quicker in their day. And no, she's a lady.
Hitler marched unchallenged into Czechoslovakia, and very soon the factory was under the control of the Wehrmacht. Most of the production was put towards the ammunition and the production of shells. The final day of the war, the remnants of the Luftwaffe in Czechoslovakia took off to go home. On their way home, they bombed Vladislav, virtually destroying the factory. For what reason? Nobody knows. But I suspect that this was one way of the Germans getting back for the lack of cooperation of the Czech people during the war.
So after the Second World War, the political climate was completely different. Czechoslovakia entered a very dark period in its history when the communists were in power. It purely existed in its own domestic arena without any interaction from the outside world. And despite those gloomy times, they were very inventive, and they used their skills and craftsmanship to develop not just a utilitarian vehicle, but this beautiful Felicia, a sports car, a roadster, which to people in Central Europe at that time was the car of their dreams. The classic Felicia, manufactured between 1959 and 1964. Its name means happiness, which comes from the Latin.
I came by it by being on holiday in Czechoslovakia, as it was then, and I heard about the car being renovated by an ex-Skoda engineer, so went along to see it, and fell in love with it immediately. And I said I'd go back and buy it a couple of months later when it was finished. But a fortnight before we were due to go, we heard that the engineer who had renovated it had to be taken into hospital. So we feared for the state of the car, but we were assured that in typical Czech there's no problem. Anyway, we went over there and found that the car had been finished off by his son-in-law, who was a bit of a cowboy, so none of the detailed stuff seemed to work very well. We set off in the rain, me driving a left-hand drive for the first time, and the darkness fell and we switched the headlights on and they immediately pointed at the sky. Every time we went down a hill, the twin carbs seemed to be pulling in different directions because there were flames out the exhaust. Then we switched indicators on, found that the left indicator was indicating right, and so on. Then we set off down the ramp to the ferry, banging and crashing from the exhaust, parked on the ferry, and thank goodness had a good dinner and a night's rest, and got to Hull the next morning. I got to a garage, stopped for petrol, and found I had a terrific petrol leak. It was pouring out underneath as fast as I was pouring it in. but we managed to fix that, and we eventually got the 180 miles home.
Skoda's marketing in the 50s was very hesitant, and the language they used was double Dutch. I can't imagine why they were unable to get in communist Czechoslovakia somebody who could translate English more effective than they seemed to manage. If I can just quote from one of the brochures, "Experiences accumulated for years were expressed in these types by all desirable advantages." I've no idea what that actually means. However, by the early 60s, Skoda was seriously marketing in this country. The early 60s brochures were not only very glamorous, but showed a great deal of humour. The Octavia brochure, I remember, in 1961, has a series of family photographs on holiday. In it, one of the daughters writes a letter home to her friend, telling them what a wonderful time they were having in their new car. This kind of technique was used 20-odd years later by Citroën, but it's not the kind of advertising you expect of Skoda at this period.
Another thing that appealed to me was the fact that with these cars, as there were no service stations available in Czechoslovakia except on the very main roads, the cars were designed and the equipment with the car was provided so that you could in fact do a major overhaul at the roadside, which quite often you had to do. In the boot of this car, as well as the petrol tank, which is in one side, on the other side you've got a 20-litre jerry can, which is part of the equipment and strapped in. And this is intended to see you to the next place where you can buy petrol, which could be a long way away. This car came out originally in 1959, and there was a saloon version and also an estate version at the same time. But of course the convertible was much rarer. It was slightly dearer than the other cars, and therefore it didn't sell so well. And of course, being a convertible, it had to be looked after and garaged, and a lot of them weren't garaged, and the hood rotted and the water got in, and therefore there are not many of them about now. In fact, there are only two that I know of in this country that are running on the roads or capable of doing so. It's very great fun to drive.